Arkistas Ring, originally released in 1990 for the North American NES, featuring a female protagonist who's an elf who is trying to save a ring that's been captured by an evil force. However, after all these years, is Arkistas Ring still worth playing today? Arkistas Ring is one of those games that did not see release outside of North America. There was no European release or even Japanese release, even though the team was made up of Japanese developers. The game was published by American Sammy, who would also publish games like Twin Cobra, Vice Project Doom, and one of my personal favorite games in the East series, Ys 3: Wanderers of Ys for the Super Nintendo. There is some conflicting reports, though, on whether or not the game was developed by them, as some credit the development with a company called NMK. The game's story revolves around the Elven Kingdom, and in particular a village named Arkista. Inside this village is a ring, and the ring is said to have great power and bring happiness and joy and prosperity to those who are around it. Many come from around the Elven Kingdom in order to reap the benefits of the ring. There's also a few other artifacts of the Elven Kingdom that are held in this small village of Arkista. There's an evil force, though, looming not too far ahead in the evil ninja dungeon named the Shogun, and one day he decides to go into the village and steal these artifacts. Of course, the elves are in a panic, but soon, Christine, one mighty warrior elf, steps up to the plate and decides that she will go and rescue these artifacts from the evil Shogun. And thus, the game begins. Arkistas Ring is an action game with a top-down perspective for its viewpoint. I've seen some comparisons to The Legend of Zelda, though that honestly has to be only in an aesthetic standpoint of the viewpoint of the camera, and of course it's in a fantasy setting. Arkistas Ring takes place over 31 levels. In fact, once you complete those 31 levels for the first time, they actually loop back around, going back to level 1, which is now level 32. You can actually go through the game 4 times, with the enemies increasing in speed and making things much more difficult to complete with each passing loop, for a total of 124 stages. When your journey begins, you have a limited amount of health and supplies at your disposal to help Christine throughout the adventure. Every time you defeat an enemy, though, there's a chance they will drop a bag that contains a random item. These items include extra armor pieces, which work as extra hit points for your character. You can find stuff like health potions, weapons that will be able to aid you in your battle, more inventory slots, extra lives, and even points. The way that levels work, you defeat a certain number of enemies, in which case a key will appear. You can grab the key and then go to the exit to move on to the next stage. There may sometimes still be more enemies lurking around the level, but you don't have to defeat them. Once you have the key, you can move on. The exits are usually represented by a gate or a staircase and are easy to tell which ones they are until later in the game when there's fake exits for you to deal with. Not only by getting a fake exit, you don't move on to the next level, it usually ends up spawning an enemy. And some of the really late levels, they spawn some really difficult enemies that you'll have to contend with, making some of the late game stages particularly a nuisance. There's actually a decent variety to the types of enemies you're going to be battling. You have gelatinous blobs, squids, harpies, skeletons, ogres, zombies, a couple of bosses here and there, including the Shogun at the end of the game, and these change up from each area to each area, making the new places you make it to feel a bit fresh. Usually these areas also include different color schemes to make the levels look unique to one another. One of the things I loved about Arkistas Ring, which seems like a weird point, is that the world felt interconnected. Levels felt like they went into one another. There were so many times in retro games where you would go from a forest level to a fire level to an ice level, with no real rhyme or reason for doing so other than the game's design. The levels in Arkistas Ring, though, feel like they lead right into one another for the most part. You're outside of a dungeon, then you're inside it in the next level, and then once you get through the dungeon, you're back outside with the dungeon behind you, leading you eventually to the next dungeon, and so on and so forth. Even in the manual, they include kind of the path that you're going to be taking throughout your adventure, and it just made it feel like that interconnected world, something that I just didn't see very often back in the day. As the journey begins in Arkistas Ring, you start off near the Phoenix Volcano. The second level actually has the volcano on the map for you to see where it is, and soon afterwards, though, you're in the village of Arkista itself, so you kind of get to see what the village looks like a little bit. This ends up leading, though, into the Maze of the Undead, with zombies everywhere for you to deal with. But once you escape it though, you're in a small port area. Here you actually have water and squids that you have to actually face off with. This leads to the Marble Castle and the Harpy Lair, before making it to the Old Elven Graveyard, one of my favorite little areas. You actually get to see tombstones all set up throughout this area. Right after that though is the lair of Grand Master Fang, known as the House of Fangs. Grand Master Fang is one of the few little mini bosses that you'll have to deal with, and he is a relatively tough fight if you try to take him on one-on-one, though a few nicely used items will greatly help you out in that battle. If you're able to escape the House of Fangs, you have the Dread Dungeon, and then the Last Chance Bridge. Basically, your last opportunity to turn around and go back home before going into the Ninja Dungeon, which is the last area of the game, which holds the Shogun and Arkistas Ring itself. It's a grand adventure for sure. Christine has to travel through quite a lot before eventually being able to get a hold of Arkistas Ring and bring it back to her village, and that's all contained within this small NES game, and it's 32 levels. Of course, Christine isn't doing this adventure alone. She does have her trusty bow and arrow that she'll be able to take out most enemies with, but the other items that you're able to get, like I mentioned before, you do have your standard stuff, but some of the more important weapons that you can potentially get from the random bags include the Thunder Wand, which will take out most enemies out on screen in a single flash. Then there is the Holy Stick. Now this can only kill certain abominations, but they're usually enemies that you wouldn't be able to kill any other way. Then there's the very important Ninja Stunner. Late in the game is usually when these show up, and they allow you to put to sleep the ninjas. The ninjas are the hardest enemy by far in Arkistas Ring. They're extremely fast and deal a lot of damage, especially the higher variants of them. So putting them to sleep even for just a few moments to take care of them is a great help in the last few levels, especially if you play through the game a couple of times and do multiple loops. When you make it to the upper 100 levels, these are really important. The best item though by far is the Fire Wand. This, for one level when you use it, will allow you to shoot fire instead of using your arrows. It goes through walls, defeating a lot of tougher enemies easily, as well as it does a lot of damage. Stocking up on Fire Wands as much as possible will greatly help you out in your adventure. The final three items of importance though are the Elven Artifacts. The Elf Mirror, which will actually be able to protect you if you have it. You have the Wealth Amulet, which, one of the more useless items. You get points every time you make a step, so basically it would be like gaining, I guess, money every time you made a step, which is cool in concept, but doesn't really work all that well here. And then Arkistas Ring. Once you beat the game for the first loop, you get Arkistas Ring, which actually heals you with your steps, so if you've taken a little bit of damage, you can walk around for a few moments and regain some of your health. One of the only disappointing factors for me in Arkistas Ring is the final ending to the game, once you've actually played through the game 4 times. Playing through the game just one time through the first 31 levels is still enjoyable to this day, but if you actually play through all 4 loops, it can be a bit of a chore, and your only reward for doing so, though, is the status screen. In between levels, you can actually press the select button to get to the status screen. Here you see a picture of Christine, a little bit of information about her, and all the items that you currently have in your inventory are listed for you, in case you were wondering what exactly they were. That's all you end up getting with your score tallied at the end, which is a pretty disappointing thing overall, but then again, being an NES game, endings weren't always the best. The action and control of Christine for the most part is pretty good, though it is one of those games where you can't look in a direction without moving it, so there are times when you're trying to just fire in one direction, but you're forced to move there too, so you end up running into an enemy or other hazard, losing a little bit of health. Thankfully though, if you do end up gaming over, you can continue from where you left off though. There's an infinite number of continues for you to take advantage of, so you're never really in too much of a threat of having to start the game all the way over from the beginning, though there is no save system or passwords. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find out a ton of information about those who created the game outside of the composer Shigeyoshi Okamura. While the music isn't spectacular, the opening theme to Arkistas Ring is a particular favorite of mine. Arkistas Ring is one of those games I remember fondly from my childhood. It's also a good example of a female protagonist in the lead role in an NES game. When many hadn't played Metroid at the time, Christine was right on the front cover. Overall, the fantasy setting of Arkistas Ring was able to bring me in as a child, and it's something that I really enjoy even today going back and replaying it. I would definitely recommend checking it out if you've never gotten an opportunity to do so. I'm not saying it's the greatest game ever, and it can get repetitive, but the action and setting are actually enjoyable. So with that, guys, though, that's going to wrap up this retro review. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.